Silvia Rodriguez, in A Compendium of Lacanian Terms, explains it quite clearly. The Lacanian subject is not the unified subject of knowledge, but the subject as it has emerged in the experience of psychoanalysis, divided, inconsistent, incomplete, punctuated rather than full. Lacan has said, the unconscious is a thinking with words, with thoughts that escape your vigilance. Though split between the conscious and unconscious, it seems entirely plausible that the subject is partly a result of the endeavor of language to iterate what is driven from the unconscious. The subject being split evidences its lack of power and leaves one with a loss of being. Lacan says, where is the subject? It is necessary to find the subject as a lost object. More precisely, this lost object is the support of the subject, and in many cases is a more abject thing than you may care to consider. Lacan recognized the potential for loss in the case of the subject, and I see the potential for loss in the process of interaction with media. The subject loses effect to fusion. Dylan Evans explains a way in which Lacan uses the notation of the subject, which is relevant here as well. Evans explains, Lacan establishes a distinction between the subject and the ego, which will remain one of the most fundamental distinctions throughout the rest of his work. Whereas the ego is part of the imaginary order, the subject is part of the symbolic. Thus, the subject is not simply equivalent to a conscious sense of agency, which is a mere illusion produced by the ego, but to the unconscious. Lacan's subject is the subject of the unconscious. Certainly the ways in which media work on the subject could avail such an understanding of the subject as the subject of the unconscious. The Lacanian subject, fragility comes from its split. Such a weak and split nature predisposes persons to entrapment and fusion. The basic form of self is shifted in such a way as to alter one's perception. To include it in a media process involves interaction with violence and violation. The person and the device become fused by a process which lies beyond the reach of any intention. One's very instincts are manipulated, and the person becomes a perfect specimen for continued media exploitation. In regards to media and the treatment of the subject as unconscious or split, fusion is a process in which the subject is subjugated and disappears in the frenzy and flash of media. The lack of substantiality in the subject and it being derived from the unconscious allows for the manipulation of the subject and predetermines the occurrence of the fusion process. The whole of the fusion process, now holding a negative connotation, comes to light when one grasps how the subject works. Media's ensnaring effects are based on desire and seduction, but the vulnerability of the subject as well. If I am a poem is any indication, then the subject is written and thus can be scripted by media as well. The subject's conscious nature, the advent use of media, and the person's willful use of media perpetuate the process of envelopment of the subject by media. Considering the unconscious, the split subject, the subtleties of media process configuration and connectivity, the subject is susceptible. In reality, the subject as unconscious and media as subjugating the essence of life together provide a recipe for fusion. When it is understood that the virtual is realer than real, as Brian Massumi has stated, realizing media's potential devastation to the subject only magnifies its effect. Massumi indicates there is a seductive image of contemporary culture circulating today. Our world, Jean Baudrillard tells us, has been launched into hyperspace in a kind of postmodern apocalypse. The airless atmosphere has asphyxiated the referent, leaving us satellites in aimless orbit around an empty center. This vulnerability of the subject in Massumi's statement, the referent, has seemingly developed in the postmodern era.